Greetings and welcome to the first part of the first lecture or presentation in this course or this part of the broader Army Cost Management Certificate course or CMCC. My name is Peter Coughlin, often called Pete, but I'll go by either Peter or Pete. And I am going to be the professor for this course. Now, this part of the course, or this part of the program, is MN4354, and the official name is Financial Analysis and Cost Management. It's actually had that name since the beginning of CMCC a few years ago, but the content has actually evolved such that what the focus of this third course in the program is cost-benefit analysis. Right? That's what we're going to focus on from both a conceptual and an applied sense. And we'll talk about today, today will be an introduction to cost-benefit analysis. Understand, what it is and why it makes sense. There'll be a more sort of applied presentation later in this week from my colleague Dan Nussbaum. So we'll give a little more contextual knowledge. So in terms of a little more about actual Army practice of cost-benefit analysis. That said, you'll see that I will significantly reference the Army perspective in particular on cost-benefit analysis as we proceed. All right, well, rather than start with the boring introduction of myself or of the course or of the concepts as these intro presentations typically do, let's instead start with something a little more interesting, which is a story, a history lesson, if you will. So back in 1772, the great British scientist Joseph Priestley, who was known for, he was at least credited with the discovery of oxygen, he had been invited to become the librarian for the Earl of Shelburne. Not sure exactly what that entails, but obviously it must have been a position of some interest because he wrote to his friend Benjamin Franklin and asked for some advice, right? Asked his opinion basically of whether or not he should accept the job offer. And Benjamin Franklin sent Priestley the following letter in reply. Dear Sir, in the affair of so much importance to you, wherein you ask my advice, I cannot advise you what to determine, but if you please, I will tell you how. When these difficult cases occur, they are difficult chiefly because while we have them under consideration, all the reasons, pro and con, are not present to the mind at the same time. To get over this, my way is to divide a sheet of paper into two columns, writing over the one, pro, and over the other, con. Then, during 3 or 4 days' consideration, I put down under the different heads the different motives that occur to me for or against the measure. When I have thus got them all together in one view, I endeavor to estimate their respective weights. Where I find two, one on each side, that seem equal, I strike them both out. If I find a reason pro equal to some 2 reasons con, I strike out the 3. If I judge some 2 reasons con equal to some 3 reasons pro, I strike out the 5. Thus proceeding, I find at length where the balance lies. The weight of reasons cannot be taken with the precision of algebraic quantities, yet when each is thus considered separately and comparatively, and the whole lies before me, I think I can judge better, and I am less likely to take a rash step. In fact, I have found great advantage from this kind of equation in what may be called moral or prudential algebra. Wishing sincerely that you may determine for the best, yours most affectionately, B. Franklin. So, Ben Franklin was not only one of our founding fathers, he was one of our founding cost-benefit analysts. Right? There in this letter from 200 plus years ago, we see Ben Franklin actually articulate many of the elements that are core to cost-benefit analysis. First, basically, from the broad level, he's using a structured approach to identify and compare pros and cons or costs and benefits, right? A systematic structured approach. He identifies and lists all relevant costs and benefits, and the emphasis here is the importance of simply writing things down. Actually write them down, don't just keep them in your head, but actually just document. That's step one. Just simply identify the pros and the cons and actually write them down. Don't do it, in a half-hour sitting, but he actually takes 3 or 4 days of consideration, right, to do so, right? And he's really sort of recognizing the importance of not neglecting, relevant impacts, right? So therefore, something may not occur to you on day one, but if you go through thorough consideration, you may remember, and by maintaining this list, you can actually make sure you cover all of the possible pros and cons. And in addition to simply documenting them, when you have them, this is, as he says at the very beginning, the challenge and the complexity is because all of the pros and cons aren't in your mind at the same time. But when writing them down on one sheet of paper, they are. They at least appear to you. They are present in the mind at the same time, right? He talks about having the whole before me, right? And so he's recognizing the cognitive benefit of getting all key aspects within one analysis. Look at everything at the same time. Right? Then once doing so, again, estimating the respective weights to place on each of the various costs and benefits. Right? One of the big challenges in costs and benefit analysis is the weighting of particular pros and cons, particularly where they're non-financial. Right? How do we measure certain things like the value of life, the value of time, the value of convenience, the value of, say, clean air. Right? So he recognizes, though, that he's got to estimate, to weigh these things, which may be very abstract, but he also admits it's not necessarily going to be achieved mathematical precision. You're not necessarily going to have to get it exactly right in terms of whether one should be weighted 3 times another, or 3.5 times another, or 2 or 4 times another. But understands the importance of at least trying to put some weighting on them. He then, of course, looks to balance the pros and cons using a common measure. So he's using a common weight. We will often, for example, when we do cost-benefit analysis, we will want to make sure everything is in dollars, right? Because if we're going to talk about how much something costs in dollars, we want to say, well, is it worth the benefits? Well, we can't measure the benefits by improved accuracy or greater throughput time. Ultimately, in order to compare costs and benefits, we have to compare apples to apples, and so everything has to be in a common measure, right? In this case, the measure he uses is not dollars, but he does assign a weighting such that everything on the pro side and everything on the con side can be compared, right? And then, once they can be compared, he sort of subtracts from consideration anything on the left that's equal to a set of anything on the right, and vice versa. Right? And ultimately, sees what's left over. Where does the balance lie? Right? And that's the alternative that's chosen. Where is the ultimate sum of the weighted reasons greater on the side of the costs or the benefits, the pros or the cons? Right? It's also important to note that he talks about this as, although an imprecise tool perhaps, it is a tool that helps us judge better, quote unquote. It's not a decision mechanism in itself. He's not saying that you do the analysis and whatever comes out, that's your decision, right? But it does help you make a better judgment, right? And that's how cost-benefit analysis, again, is not a decision methodology, it's a decision input, or a tool that is an input decision-making. He also points out the behavioral role of cost-benefit analysis as a tool to avoid a quote-unquote rash step. We will talk about towards the end of the course, right? The sort of cognitive and behavioral biases that exist within any organization that cause not only people, but organizations, Fortune 500 companies, governments, to make quote-unquote irrational decisions, right, based on certain behavioral biases. Right? And so the cost-benefit analysis at least helps guard against making a impulsive behavioral choice and make sure that those choices are justified in dollar and cents terms or some other cost-benefit comparison terms. Now, the last thing, though, he does, leave us with this question, which is, he suggests that the weight of reasons cannot be analyzed with precision of algebraic quantities, but that doesn't seem to be a yes or no question, right? It's to what degree can we use a methodology in which we're weighting pros and cons, costs and benefits, to achieve something close to the precision of algebraic quantities. To what degree can we do that? And throughout this course, we will talk about proper ways to do that, particularly when we have things that are non-monetary costs or benefits. So again, here we have Ben Franklin illustrating so many of the key aspects of cost-benefit analysis at the time before the founding of our country. So what are we going to cover today? So here are the concepts that we're going to cover in this introductory lecture. First is the basic principles of cost-benefit analysis. Then the necessity of cost-benefit analysis. Why do we need to do it? What's the point? Then going through the process, sort of an overview of the process. We will then actually go step by step through that process and explain each step. Finally, I will offer some revisions to the process. We're going to go through the steps as dictated in the Army Cost-Benefit Analysis Guide. But I think there's some advisable revisions to that steps, or additions in some cases, but sort of modifications that might help the process. Finally, we will, after we get the process right, we'll see where the process can go wrong. So we'll talk about the challenges and pitfalls of cost-benefit analysis, what makes it difficult and what might make it go wrong, right? Then what's your role as either the cost-benefit analysis or analyst or the person who will be reviewing cost-benefit analyses, and then conclude, of course, with a summary. But before we actually let me point out that this is a lot of material. So I'm actually going to break it into 3 parts. We're actually going to, right now in the present presentation, only cover the first 3 bullet points: the principles, the necessity, and the process of cost-benefit analysis. The cost-benefit analysis step by step is detailed enough that we'll actually do that in a separate recording. All the slides are together on Sakai, but I will do a separate presentation recording for just that one bullet point. Right? And finally, in the third part, we will talk about my proposed revisions to the prescribed cost-benefit analysis process, the challenges and pitfalls, the role of the cost-benefit analysis, and the summary. But first, before we get into sort of the introduction to cost-benefit analysis, before I introduce the concepts, why don't I introduce myself more formally than I did earlier? My basic info, again, my name is Peter, or Pete, Coughlin. You can call me Peter, you can call me Pete. You can call me Dr. Coughlin if you want, but that's not necessary. I am an associate professor, and I'm an associate professor in the Graduate School of Business and Public Policy. We don't actually have more specific sort of groups than that, or at least I wouldn't necessarily fit into one particular group. But my expertise is both in managerial economics and business strategy. And I've been at NPS now for 10 years. So it'll be 10 years this summer I will have been at NPS. And that's my email and my cell phone number. I do have an office phone number, but honestly, I don't even know it. I actually just moved into this office about a month ago. And I rarely use that number. So the best number to get me is at my cell phone. And if you need me urgently, the cell phone is actually, you have my permission to call me any time of the day, any time of night. I will have my phone on mute if I don't want to be disturbed. So please feel free to call me, leave a message. And in fact, to be honest, the easiest way to reach me is via text message at that number, because then if I'm in a meeting or otherwise occupied and can't answer the phone, I can certainly see the text message, and I get inundated with so many emails that that if you want my immediate attention, then certainly a text message is more likely a better form of written communication than even an email. But if you want my thorough sort of response or thoughts on something, and it's not necessarily time sensitive or critically urgent, then certainly, of course, just communicate via email. Now, the way I'm recording this using a PowerPoint show or PowerPoint presentation and other format, but it's not Collaborate or Illuminate or VTC, so you don't get to see my handsome smiling face, so I might as well go ahead and show you. That's my official professional profile picture. Very misleading. I'm far less attractive than that. Not that necessarily is attractive, but you will soon see. But that's my requisite picture in front of the bookcase that all of us professors, must have. So that's my basic info. Let me tell you a little more about my background. And to describe my background, a picture with 1,000 words. So rather than just tell you or list, I figured I would show you geographically with a map. So I was actually born at Westover Air Force Base. So I am a Air Force brat. As you will soon find out, I was born into the Air Force. I was married to the Marine Corps for a while. And I, of course, worked for the Navy. So born military, married military, work military, not actually military myself, right? And the only branch that I have not had either a familial or professional affiliation is actually the Army. So this is my first direct work for the Army. Obviously, I've had many Army students in my time at MBS. So anyway, I was born at Westover Air Force Base, and my father was a B-52 pilot, and so we then traveled around to various Air Force bases in Grand Forks, North Dakota, SAC headquarters in Offutt in Nebraska, and Armed Forces Staff College down in Norfolk, then Griffiths Air Force Base, now defunct, I guess, in Rome, New York, until finally my father finished his time in the Air Force at the Pentagon. And so he retired after working at the Pentagon, and he retired and still is in Virginia. That's where I went to high school, and then I also went to college at the University of Virginia. So I got my bachelor's degree in a double major in mathematics and economics with a minor in statistics. So a very quant type person. And then I immediately went to grad school out at Caltech in Pasadena, where I got my master's degree in economics. After a couple years there, I actually had gone intending to go right through to my PhD, but after a couple years, I got a promising or attractive job offer from Booz Allen Hamilton. So I left Caltech and took a job with Booz Allen Hamilton, where I did management consulting. I worked primarily with government clients, so I've been working in the government context for an extended period now. But after several years doing management consulting, I realized that I actually didn't like the real world so much and actually preferred the academic world, or the precision of academics, I guess. And so I returned to Caltech and got my PhD, finished my PhD and got my PhD in economics. Right? I then, my first academic position after getting a PhD was at the Harvard Business School. So I spent 6 years on the faculty at HBS. I was officially in the strategy unit, but that's at Harvard. I was an economist, my economics PhD, but there was no economics group at the Harvard Business School. It is simply there are economists sprinkled out through finance and negotiations and operations and strategy and business and government, right? And so I was in the strategy group, so I taught strategic management, but I also taught courses in managerial economics. Then after 6 years there, I began my route to the Naval Postgraduate School. I was actually sort of following my, at that time, active duty Marine wife. Now she's my active duty Marine ex-wife. But so I came out to the Naval Postgraduate School. I became a professor of managerial economics and strategy. I was in residence there for about 4 years. But then, following my wife's transfer to the DC area, I then actually started, for the last 6 years, up until last month, I've been living in the Northern Virginia, Washington, D.C. area and teleworking. So I've been teaching distance learning executive MBA courses for the last 6 years. I've also been teaching some resident short courses. I'll talk about that in a second. But I primarily actually have been doing research. So manpowers and acquisitions research. I've been doing cost-benefit analyses in both contexts. And that's primarily where my funding came from, during those 6 years. But as I mentioned, I would teach executive MBA classes from either VTC facilities in the DC area or even from a VTC studio that I had set up in my home office. Right? But I would then often fly back to Monterey to teach these short courses like the one that the CMCC used to be, right? But in several short courses, and I would go back for research as well. And so for 6 years, my life looked something like this, right? Traveling back and forth between Monterey and DC at least once a month, if not several times a month, traveling back and forth. Until finally, just last month, I decided to come back full-time and be back in residence here. And so last month I returned to Monterey and am back now full-time in residence at the Naval Postgraduate School. So that's my story. How does that have relevance, if you will, to this course, besides just telling you a bit about myself? Well, and actually I want to offer a fair warning that about my learning curve that will be present and probably quite evident as we go through this course. Now, first of all, I do have significant relevant capabilities and experience. As I mentioned, it's been 16 years now. I've been teaching and researching economic analysis for 16 years as a professor. I have a strong familiarity with the military context, as I mentioned, by birth, marriage, and employment for the last 10 years. And have conducted numerous cost-benefit analysis in multiple application areas in manpower acquisitions and operations within the Navy, Marine Corps, and some work with the Army context. Right? And I am, moreover, an experienced teacher, especially in terms of distance learning, as we're doing now. I've done it with the executive MBA program especially, so a lot of distance learning teaching, primarily via video teleconferencing. And I have been recognized as a pretty strong teacher. I have actually been awarded by 2 different graduating classes the Liskin Award for Teaching Excellence. In other words, the students vote on the best professor in the MBA program, and I've won that award. I've been awarded that distinction by 2 different MBA graduating classes. So that's sort of the good news, that I have the experience in the field and experience teaching. The bad news is there are a lot of new challenges that this will bring me. Right? This is actually my first time ever teaching cost-benefit analysis. As I mentioned, I've, of course, studied cost-benefit analysis. I've conducted cost-benefit analysis, but this has been my first time teaching it. Right? And it's also my first time teaching in the Army CMCC program. Right? I was supposed to teach in it previously. I was going to teach it in the summer and earlier quarters, but of course, those editions of the CMC program were canceled, right, as they were converting to this now distance learning format. At the time, it was a resident program, right? So I had a few false starts, but this is my first time actually getting to teach in the CMCC program. It's also my first time using Collaborate and Illuminate. As I mentioned, I've done a lot of video teleconference teaching, a lot of distance learning, so that's not new to me at all. But the Executive MBA program that I've been teaching with doesn't use Collaborate or Illuminate. And so I've gotten familiar with technology, and I'm excited about it. And frankly, I think the other programs, the Executive MBA program, should use it. There's so much that you can do. There's certain disadvantages, I suppose, but what you can do with it is very exciting. And so we will be, of course, are not doing it this week, but we'll be using Collaborate and Illuminate. But it's going to be a bit of a learning curve for me on that as well. It's also my first time teaching a course with asynchronous delivery. In fact, it's the first time I think I don't know that certainly the business school at MPS has ever delivered a course with this much asynchronous delivery, right? And so there's not a lot of institutional knowledge. As I was even preparing these slides or this presentation, trying to find somebody who could tell me, sort of lessons learned about how to do it, was very difficult, right? And I'd be sort of curious about how other faculty have done it, and maybe I can learn from their experiences. But this is something that is new to me. And it's also the first time I'll be teaching 2 different courses at the same time. So I will actually, in addition to teaching this course, I am teaching my Executive MBA Strategic Management course. So I'm teaching that, 2 segments of that. So I've never done that in my 16 years as a professor. So that'll be a bit of a challenge, going from the cost-benefit analysis mindset to the strategic management mindset. Now that said, I've taught the strategy course pretty much every year of my entire 16-year, career as a professor. So that is not as much of a learning curve, right? And so I'm able to put a little more attention, certainly to this course as opposed to that one. But there are going to be some challenges in terms of time availability because I'm doing that. So a lot of firsts here, right? So what I'm asking, is that please be patient. As just as you are learning, I will be learning, right? I'll be learning and adjusting, and I'm quite confident I will ultimately deliver an exemplary product. But please understand there are some startup costs here, and especially this first week, early on, first couple weeks, right? There might be some adjustment in terms of content preparation, delivery, understanding how Collaborate works, etc. So starting from scratch in all of this, but I think I'm quite confident, and we'll find out. But I'm quite confident that you will be very pleased with the end result. Okay, so back to having introduced myself, now let's go back to our introduction to cost-benefit analysis. And of course, we start with the basic principles. What is the basics? What is cost-benefit analysis, right? What is at the core of cost-benefit analysis? Well, so first of all, what is cost-benefit analysis, right? Well, cost-benefit analysis is a set of procedures, right? It's a process. It's a system. It's a methodology. It's an approach, right, to making a decision. It's a approach to creating an input to that decision to hopefully guide better decision making, right? And the idea is it's a method to sort of quantify along some measure the various choices before you and then to compare them along that measurement, right? Whether it be dollars savings, it could be profit for a business. It could be some, like I say, net benefits. Generally speaking, it could be cost savings. It could be improvement in your grades. It could be any sort of quantitative measure to compare alternative choices. Right? And it involves sort of measuring the pros and cons, as Ben Franklin did, the costs and the benefits, the advantages or disadvantages. Right? And the choice that you're trying to make could either be a yes or no, go or no go. You could have a particular choice or action. Should we do this or not? Should we build this? Should we close this, this base? Should, a yes or no decision, right? Or it could be that it's not yes or no, it's which of the following 3 options, 4 options, 5 options should we choose, right? So it might be choosing among a set of possible options. And of course, the objective is to decide which one should be chosen, right? Or whether to do it or not, or which one should be chosen. You will sometimes hear, in fact, it will even be in our readings, referred to as, instead of cost-benefit analysis, it will be referred to as benefit-cost analysis. Right? And those are the same things, right? CBA is the same as BCA. Some people call it benefit-cost analysis. Why? Maybe they think it's more optimistic to mention benefit before cost. I'm not sure. Right? But the Army convention and my convention certainly is to talk about it in terms of cost-benefit analysis, so that's what we'll do, but do understand that they are equivalent. Now, you may also be familiar with the concept, and we will talk about it in this course, of cost-effectiveness analysis, or CEA, right? There's also something equivalent called BEA, benefit effectiveness analysis, but you rarely hear about that. But you might be familiar with cost-effectiveness analysis. Well, we will talk about cost-effectiveness analysis and how it differs from general cost-benefit analysis later in the course. I won't get into it too much now, but the truth is it's actually a special case. Cost-effectiveness analysis is a type of cost-benefit analysis. And just to foreshadow a bit, cost-effectiveness analysis is basically where you compare alternatives based only on their costs, assuming that the benefits are the same. Right? It's when you have equal benefits, then all you care about is minimizing cost. Right? So it's a type of cost-benefit analysis in which the benefits of all options are the same. So if that's sort of my definition, if you will, of cost-benefit analysis, what does the Army say? What's the Army's definition? And so I've actually taken language directly from various Army training briefs that I've reviewed, particularly in preparation for this course, to give you the Army definition of cost-benefit analysis. Now, normally I don't like to read slides to you, right? You can do that on your own. The whole point of my voice in this presentation is to add some nuance, hopefully, to what's on these slides. But in this case, I will. I will read exactly what's there because it is precisely word for word the Army definition of cost-benefit analysis. So, cost-benefit analysis is a structured methodology for forecasting and comparing anticipated costs and benefits of alternative courses of actions, which we will abbreviate COAs, in order to identify the optimum solution for achieving a stated goal or objective. It involves the weighing of total expected costs against the total expected benefits over the near, far, and life cycle timeframes from an Army enterprise perspective, with the ultimate goal of allowing resource-informed decisions. And the true basic idea of cost-benefit analysis is pretty simple. Take the benefits of a course of action, subtract the costs of that course of action, and what you're left with are the net benefits of that course of action. Right? And then you choose the course of action which has the greatest net benefits. Alternatively, if you're thinking in terms of should we do it or not, a yes, go or no go decision, you can simply think of it as a scale, a weighting. Put the costs on one side, the benefits on another, similar to Benjamin Franklin's putting the pros on one and the cons on the other. If the costs outweigh the benefits, don't do it. If the benefits outweigh the costs, do it. Right? Pretty basic idea. Right? That academics and, of course, the Army and business use a lot of words to describe, but this is the basic idea. I think is pretty straightforward. We all understand it. Now, it may at first seem like this is a simple accounting exercise, right? You simply sum up the costs and the benefits. What are the costs? Okay, put the numbers down, add them up, right over the benefits, okay, add numbers up. But the reality is it actually requires, sort of a broad application, but also a deep application of economic thinking and principles, right? We're going to ask you to sort of think like an economist. Think about things like opportunity costs and discounting and the proper way to think about ideas like willingness to pay. What's the value? What's the value of a life? What's the value of lost time? These are things that economists think about all the time and have methodologies and ways of analyzing them and ways of thinking about them. So we're gonna want you to think like an economist, so you can accurately identify and quantify costs and benefits. Right? You can account for the time frame in which they accrue. Right? Determining the opportunity costs of resources, and we'll talk specifically what we mean by opportunity costs, but of course, the value of any resource, the cost of any resource, is the opportunity that's foregone. Right? If somebody gives me a concert ticket to go see Bruce Springsteen, if I get it for free, the cost of that ticket is not free to me. Right? But rather, what is the opportunity cost of me going to the Bruce Springsteen concert? It's what else could I sell that ticket for? What else could I do with my time instead of going to the Bruce Springsteen concert? Right? So we measure, of course, costs and benefits in terms of the opportunity costs. Right? But also, the idea of how do you determine values of intangibles? Lives saved, greater convenience, time saved, enhanced morale. These might seem like things that you can't quantify. Or worse yet, even if you can quantify, right, put a number to it, right, morale has gone up from 20% satisfaction to 50% satisfaction. How do you go from those numbers to a monetary number? If that's a benefit you want to compare it to a dollar cost, how do you do it? Well, economists do have ways that they do that. And that's so cost-benefit analysis is not just an accounting exercise. In fact, it's an economic exercise, and that's what we're going to be. Obviously, I'm an economist, and so that's the sort of approach that we take to cost-benefit analysis. Now, cost-benefit analysis, as we have defined it, is something you actually do every day, right? We trump it up as some big sort of process, but the reality is, look, your decision whether or not to get out of the bed when the alarm goes off, your decision what to wear, what to eat, your decision about whether or not to go jogging, your decision about, at the job, how to spend your time at work. Those are all things that implicitly you're doing some cost-benefit analysis. When you make a choice, in your mind, you somehow believe that you're choosing something with the greatest relative benefits, right? And so it's something that actually goes on subconsciously all the time, right? Of course, it may even go on more formally when you decide which house to buy, where to live, whether to accept a job opportunity, whether to stay on your military or your military civilian career, or to do something in the private sector. These are all those be a little more formal analyses, but the reality is that you probably do this all the time. But in most cases, right, it's an individual choice, and so you are both the analyst and the decision maker. Right? You do the analysis and you make the choice. We're going to emphasize conducting cost-benefit analysis as if you're an outside analyst, right? So that you are not the one making the decisions. You are, in fact, the one doing the analysis so that somebody else can make decisions. Or in your role in the Army enterprise, you may not be doing the analysis yourself, but you might be reviewing cost-benefit analyses that are ultimately either a decision that you have to make or a decision that you have to present and recommend to senior leadership. So as an outside analyst, what does that involve? Well, first of all, you have to take certain facts, constraints, assumptions, and weights, and possible course of action is given. Right? You're often told, look, you can't spend more than $1 million, right? Or that I want you to evaluate these courses of action, right? I value morale much more than this. You might be told by the decision maker what weights are, what course of action are. You might be given certain inputs to the cost-benefit analysis process, from the decision maker. They're not things that you get to choose yourself. But you will still then, of course, calculate net benefits by comparing across the courses of action, right? And then you ultimately, as an analyst, will present the evidence and perhaps even recommend a course of action, but you're not actually making the final choice. So in this case, the analyst is not the decision maker, right? And so as an analyst, you should be neutral, relying only on logic and mathematics to convey the message, right? You shouldn't have a bias one way or the other. That's part of the point, is that the cost-benefit analyst brings a hopefully objective view to a decision that the decision maker, him or herself, might not be able to have an outside, disinterested third-party perspective on. Now, there are different types of cost-benefit analysis. And one way to look at the different types is based on the timing. When did you do it? Did you do it before the course of action, during the course of action, or did you do it after the course of action? Right? Before the course of action, cost-benefit analysis is using the Latin ex ante cost-benefit analysis. Right? And this is the idea, and this is sort of the ideal, I guess, usage in some sense of cost-benefit analysis, is to be used as an input prior to decision making. Right? You haven't decided whether or not to do it or not, to go or no go, or which choice to make, and so you do a cost-benefit analysis to decide what choice you should make. You might also do a cost-benefit analysis during the course of action. You've already sort of adopted a policy, and your question is, was that a good idea or not? Should we adjust it? Should we abandon the course of action, or should we tweak the course of action? So this is sort of if you need a mid-course correction, we have what's, again, sticking to the Latin, in medias res, cost-benefit analysis. And finally, of course, there is ex post cost-benefit analysis conducted after the course of action, right? In hindsight, what were the lessons learned? Was that a good course of action? Was it a good policy, right? Looking in hindsight, of course, now it's why is it a good idea to do this sometimes? Why do people do this? Well, first of all, a lot of things that you don't know before you make a choice, right? Or things you have to make assumptions about. Afterwards, you know the actual impact. So you can instead of forecasting the impact, you can decide, was it actually a good course of action? Did the benefits outweigh the costs, right? But it also, besides deciding did we do the right thing, it also helps you to provide information about the probable costs and benefits of similar future actions, right? The next time you do an ex ante cost-benefit analysis, if the project is similar, you will be able to use what you've learned from this to make better assumptions and forecasts about what will happen if you adopt a similar course of action. Having covered the principles of cost-benefit analysis, our next element is to talk about the necessity of cost-benefit analysis, right? Why? Why should we do cost-benefit analysis? Why do we have to do this? Well, the first answer to that question of why do we have to do this is because the boss says so, right? It is a directive from the Department of the Army, right, that cost-benefit analysis must be conducted. I'm quoting here from this memo from the Vice Chief of Staff, and then as well as from the Undersecretary of the Army. Quote, we are directing that each unfunded requirement and new or expanded program proposal be accompanied by a thorough cost-benefit analysis, right? It is the directive. So, like it or not, it's something that we have to do. Now, of course, as I'll show, it is in fact advisable, right, regardless, but it is something that is required within the Army. Cost-benefit analysis is also something that's required in the federal government overall, right? It's required for many federal government policies, programs, or regulations, right? Repeated executive orders, right? Republicans and Democrats, Reagan, Clinton, Obama, have all issued specific executive orders requiring that any new or even existing or continued federal government policies, programs, or regulations must have a statement of the need for the proposed action, an examination of alternative approaches, what could we do instead, an analysis of the benefits and costs, and a discussion of the equity or distribution effects, right? And we'll talk more about those, but that basically means that who wins and who loses, who is hurt, are we creating advantages for one group at the disadvantage of another, and to what degree? That's what we mean by equity or distribution, right? And in support of these executive orders requiring CBA, the Office of Management and Budget publishes guidelines for how the CBA should be conducted, right? And the current version is OMB Circular A94, which is on Sakai and which was emailed to you, right? Which tells you in more precise terms how to actually go about doing this. How should you conduct a cost-benefit analysis for a government policy, program, or regulation? Now, why is it that the Army says we have to do cost-benefit analysis? Well, because they see significant value, right? And so again here, quoting from various Army training briefs about the value of cost-benefit analysis to the Army enterprise, right? Here again, I will make a rare exception and quote word for word. Cost-benefit analysis is valuable because it supplements professional experience, subject matter expertise, and military judgment with rigorous analytical techniques. It enables leaders and managers to make better resource-informed decisions. In other words, to make the best possible use of limited funds or get the best bang for the buck, right? Ultimately results in a strong value proposition, right? Provides a clear statement that the benefit more than justify the costs and the required trade-offs. So that is the value of cost-benefit analysis from the Army enterprise perspective. Moreover, cost-benefit analysis is already essential to Army operations, right? According to the 2013 Annual Report of Army Business Transformation, in 2012, right, over $80 billion of current and future Army requirements decisions were already supported by cost-benefit analysis, right? In that 1 year, $80 billion of decisions making in terms of future, current or future requirements were supported via cost-benefit analysis. More than 3,000 Army employees have been through some sort of cost-benefit analysis training, like CMCC, although, of course, there are others that we haven't educated 3,000 people in this program quite yet. And the cost-benefit analysis process is being implemented across virtually every major command and field operating agency across the Army, right? And in fact, as of this 2013, so a year ago, annual report, 90% of all Army organizations were using cost-benefit analysis to support resource-informed decision-making, right? So it's something that is deeply embedded within the Army operations and the culture at this point. Stepping back to a, if you will, broader question is cost-benefit analysis in terms of justifying government action at all, right? Why should the government be involved in any of this, right? Who needs government anyway, right? To quote my favorite president, as a University of Virginia graduate, of course, Thomas Jefferson, that government is best which governs least, right? Or if as an economist, of course, I've got to support Adam Smith's invisible hand of the free market, which says, look, if the government would just stay out of it, the free market would take care of it. The free market is efficient. If it really was needed, the free market would provide it. Right? Well, yes and no. Both Jefferson and Adam Smith are correct to a degree and are incorrect to another degree. Right? And so any government action, whether by the Army or by the Environmental Protection Agency or any government agency or entity, is only justified if it can improve efficiency. The OMB Circular 894 talks about the idea that any government action, the only reason there's a role for government is if somehow the private market is inefficient, right? And that the government action is required to improve efficiency, right? Either with an existing government program or with a new one, right? And there are two notions of efficiency here. It could be that the action is justified if it improves economic efficiency, right? And economic efficiency is this idea of maximizing net social benefits, right? Net benefits, which is maximizing net benefits, which is what cost-benefit analysis does, but maximizing net social benefits, the overall benefits to society. And that's the idea of economic efficiency. So if you remember your Econ 101, if you took Econ 101 in your undergrad, right, the idea here is that a market is considered efficient, or any transaction, any activity considered efficient if it actually maximizes total social welfare or total net social benefits, right? And so OMB Circular 894 supports by saying, quote, programs may be justified on efficiency grounds where they address market failure, such as public goods and externalities. On the next slide, we'll talk about what in more detail about market failure in these two examples here. But market failure means basically a situation where the market doesn't do what Adam Smith says it should, where the market does not maximize net social benefits. So that is, whenever we have one of these market failures, then it's appropriate, perhaps, for the government to be involved. But another notion of efficiency for which we advocate government intervention or government action is operating efficiency, right? Programs, quote, may also be justified where they improve the efficiency of the government's internal operations, such as cost savings investments, right? And so in many cases, what you will be either analyzing or reviewing other people's analysis of will be investments that are intended to improve the internal operation, or internal efficiency, the operating efficiency of the government, or in particular of the Army Command or the overall Army enterprise. Now, not to go back to Econ 101 and give you an economics class, although, of course, being an economist, I'd be happy to do so. Just a little more about this idea of the role of government and what government should do or not do, right? The idea here is that government has a role. Even the most conservative, laissez-faire economists will agree that government has a role to intervene where it may improve efficiency in dependence on market failure. And market failure meaning that the private market, or left to its own without government intervention, does not maximize net social benefits. And one big example of this is public goods. What's a, quote, public good? Well, the technical economic definition is any goods that is, quote, non-rival and, quote, non-excludable. Well, what the heck does that mean? Well, we say non-rival, we really mean non-rival in consumption. Something that is rival in consumption is the idea that if I consume it, you can't consume it, right? A cheeseburger is rival in consumption. If I eat it, it's not available for you to eat it. A computer, if I'm using the computer, you can't use it. So my use of it limits your use. Even, arguably, for example, a congested highway is rival in consumption, because the more, if I choose to drive on the highway, it doesn't prevent you from driving on the highway, but it reduces the quality of your consumption, because it increases traffic, increases likelihood of accidents. Anything where my consumption affects your ability or your utility or benefit from consuming it is considered rival in consumption, right? Public goods are non-rival, right? You can consume it all you want. It doesn't affect my ability to consume it or my value from consuming it. But public goods are also non-excludable, which basically means I can't prevent you from consuming it, right? Something excludable, I can prevent you from consuming that hamburger by keeping it away from you, or my computer. These are things that I can, through some means, prevent certain people from using. Non-excludable public goods, or goods that are non-excludable, which of course public goods are ones where I can't prevent you from using it. It's very difficult for me to prevent you. I can't exclude you from breathing the air. I can't exclude you from benefiting from free radio programs. How do I prevent you from receiving a radio signal? I can't do that, right? So that I can scramble certain signals, but free over-the-air radio signals is something I can't exclude you from consuming. I can't exclude you from consuming defense, right? What if you can't? A good example of public goods is national defense. The Army exists because it is a public good. Right? So from a broader perspective, we justify the existence of the Army based on the fact that there's a market failure because it's a public good. What do we mean by that? Well, the fact is that if I benefit from national defense, I feel more secure because we have the military here in the U.S. And the fact that I'm getting the benefit of military protection does not diminish somebody else's benefit from military protection. Therefore, it's non-rival. It's also not excludable. We can't choose, for example, I can't say, what, I don't want you to defend me. I don't want the U.S. military to defend me. If I live in Iowa, whether I like it or not, guess what? The U.S. military, by defending the rest of the population, is defending me. I can't, there's no way to say, well, we're going to protect everybody, but we're not going to protect you. Well, by protecting us, from foreign enemies, you are protecting every one of us. So it's not excludable, right? And that's why it's something the government should provide. The problem, of course, is free riding, right? Is that if we allowed the free market to provide military protection, right, people wouldn't pay for it, right? Because I'll let all my neighbors pay for it, but I don't have to pay for it, right? Because I benefit even if I don't pay for it, right? And that's the notion of free riding. Right. And so therefore, it's something that we fund with taxes. It's something that the government has. Even the most conservative economist would tell you that the government has a role there. Another one is externalities. Right. Externalities are when there's some external cost or benefit from a free market action. Right. The classic examples are things like pollution, or if I choose to smoke my cigarette, the benefits and the costs don't only accrue to me. Right. You might bear the cost of the secondhand smoke if you're near me. And so when there is an externality, some external impact of my choices, right, then that's a case where the government might get involved. But whereas most externalities we think about are negative, like pollution, right, and why the government gets involved in regulating, things like pollution. But it could also be positive, like R&D, right? The idea is when one company, is watching a documentary today, right, the research that Fairchild Semiconductor did in the 1950s and 1960s with Robert Noyce and others benefited the entire semiconductor industry, right? Because that knowledge filtered out through their products, but it also filtered out, through the employees who then went out and started their own businesses, right? Of course, Noyce went on with Gordon Moore and Andy Grove, all from Fairchild, to found Intel. So one person's research and development can benefit others, right? And so therefore, we have a government involvement there as well. How? First of all, the government tends to promote R&D, right, because it has a positive externality, but it also tends to protect it with things like patents, right, copyrights. These sorts of things, that intellectual property protection are ways to promote R&D. We want to promote positive things, positive externalities, because the market underprovides those. The market overprovides things with negative externalities, and therefore we want to regulate or restrict those, right? Other examples are of market failure include imperfect information, markets where there's asymmetry. For example, if it's hard to determine quality. Again, a classic example is the medical industry, right? The reason we have this asymmetric information is because we have a third-party payer system, right? The person who's paying for medical care, either the insurance or the government, if you're using Medicare, or some other government program, the person who's paying for the medical care is not the person who's consuming the medical care, right? And so therefore, I'm not paying the bill when I go and get my shoulder surgery done. So I'm willing to, I might get services I don't need as long as they're paid for, right? And as long as I have some benefit from them. And so this idea that the person who's paying the bills doesn't necessarily know whether they're really getting service that's necessary, whether they're getting the quality service. There's also an information asymmetry between you and your doctor. How do you know whether you've gotten a good angioplasty, right? It might be, you might get recommendations, off Angie's List or something for a good family doctor, but how do you really know whether your heart surgeon did a good job or not? right? If you die, you did a bad job. But truthfully, you don't actually know. There's the information asymmetry there as well. And so again, that's an argument why there's a proper role for government in markets such as that with imperfect information. Same thing, by the way, with financial markets, right? Where this whole financial crisis and this idea that certain people knew certain information that they allowed them to exploit information asymmetries, that's another role for government regulation. And finally, of course, market power, right? Monopoly or cartel. If you have a monopoly or you have a cartel, a collusion among companies, they can then, what happens is you of course, they can have above equilibrium market prices, excessive profits, under investment. So when you have monopoly or sort of market power, these other cases where we have a market failure, in other words, inefficient market. So naturally, the government gets involved in those sorts of markets with things like the Sherman Antitrust Act, et cetera. Right? Bottom line is, these areas, public goods, externalities, information, market power, these are where there's a natural role for the government where Adam Smith's invisible hand does not work. So again, when we think about the quoting from the OMB Circular A94, one of the justifications for any government action is a presence of some sort of market failure like one of these. All right, so now understanding why we do cost-benefit analysis, the next and last part of this first sort of part of the opening presentation is about the process. Let's talk about the process. How do we actually do it, right? Well, there are many different ways that you could talk about the steps of the cost-benefit analysis, right? I've already distributed you the Army CBA guide. Also distributed OMB Circular A94. Of course, every cost-benefit analysis textbook has its own list of steps for conducting cost-benefit analysis, right? Basic common logical reasoning will get you a long way there in terms of what makes sense to do, right? And as you'll see, even the official military decision-making process tends to echo the steps of cost-benefit analysis, right? And so there's many different outlines, but they all generally say the same thing. And so what we're going to do is we're going to follow step by step. We're going to follow primarily the Army CBA guide, and I'll talk about sort of revisions or adjustments that I think might be appropriate. But we'll talk about the steps as prescribed in that guide. So what are the steps for cost-benefit analysis according to the Army? Well, they are as follows. There are 8 steps. The first is to define and scope the problem or opportunity. The second is to formulate the assumptions and identify constraints. The third is to define the alternatives, in other words, which courses of action we might take. Step 4 is to develop cost estimates for the alternatives under consideration. 5 is to identify the quantifiable and the non-quantifiable benefits. Step 6 is to define the alternative selection criteria, again, how we will select among alternatives. 7 is to actually compare those alternatives according to those criteria. And finally, step 8 is to report the results and recommendations. Right? And we will, in this second part of this presentation, I will go through each of these 8 steps in greater detail. But before going through those steps in detail, I want to point out that the parallels between this approach to decision making and others. For example, the OMB A94 circular talks about the steps in cost-benefit analysis, and they talk about policy rationale, explicit assumptions, evaluation of alternatives, verification, and you can see where these steps again match up with these steps of the Army CBA process. The policy rationale is very similar to defining and scoping the problem of opportunity. Each talk about the assumptions, each talk about how you actually evaluate the alternatives, right? So again, there's a parallel. We could be doing this discussion by going through the OMB process, and we would essentially say the same things. Another way to look at, or a parallel for the cost-benefit analysis process, is the military decision-making process. And this is taken from FM50, the Army Planning and Orders Production document, right? So this is sort of the officially endorsed military decision-making process, right? And we see the process to receive the mission, analyze restated the mission, including assumptions and constraints, develop courses of action, analyze courses of action, compare the courses of action, approve a course of action, and then issue implementing orders, right? And you can again see the parallels, right? What's the mission? What's the problem or opportunity? What are the assumptions? Again, what are the assumptions and constraints? What are the alternatives? What are the, again, develop alternative course of action, right? Analyzing them is, again, about analyzing and comparing them, identifying the costs and benefits, right? And finally, of course, approving one course of action, making a recommendation. So again, you see the parallel there. Now, although I've talked about cost-benefit analysis as a step-by-step process, the truth is it's not quite so linear, right? It's actually an iterative process, right? So don't think of it as a one-way street. You do 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, then 6, then 7, then 8, and then you're done. If it were only that simple, no, right? It's actually an iterative, meaning you iterate or you repeat the process, and before you get to the final output, right? And it's also a collaborative process, right? In particular, as the analyst, if you are the analyst or the person who's reviewing the work of the analyst, you are not ultimately the decision maker. Whoever's the analyst should be collaborating with the decision maker, right? So there should be, throughout this process, as you ultimately report to the decision maker, you will then discuss things like, did we properly define the scope of the problem? Did we identify the right constraints? Did I communicate the consequences of these constraints, and did we change those constraints? Right? What about did we identify the full scope of alternative course of action? Did we you present the preliminary results and say, hey, what about considering this alternative? Right? The bottom line is that you should continually communicate with the decision maker, ask questions, right, such that you revise the process. You may go through cost-benefit analysis and then work with the decision maker and go back and say, you know what, we're going to change that assumption. We're going to expand the scope of the problem, or we're going to narrow the scope of the problem, or we're going to add additional course of action, right? So ultimately, one of the reasons it's iterative or nonlinear is because of revisions that take place as a result of collaboration with the decision maker. Another way that it's iterative and nonlinear, not even involving necessarily the decision maker, is sensitivity analysis. At the end of this process, before you do your presentation, one thing you do is you say, sensitivity analysis is saying, well, how sensitive are my conclusions or my results to certain assumptions and constraints, right? Or the set of alternatives that I looked at. And so you will initially get results and you'll say, okay, it says I should do option B, but what if I assumed, but that's because I assumed the cost of transportation was 25 cents per mile. What if the cost of transportation is 30 cents per mile? How does that change things, right? Does that change it to choose option A instead of option B, right? In that case, you might go back and revise your assumptions. You might add certain, courses of action and then recalculate. So these are reasons why you might go back to earlier stages in the process. Graphically, this iteration or nonlinear nature of cost-benefit analysis is illustrated here, right? The idea is you might get, for example, if we see on the left here, those arrows on the left, you might report preliminary results to the decision maker, and then might say, you know what? I think we're defining the problem too narrowly or too broadly. You might change the problem. You may broaden or narrow the scope. They might say, wow, that's all we can do? Okay. Well, that may be because we're only, I gave you a budget of $1 million. What could you do with 1.2 million, right? So you might change the constraints or change the assumptions based on feedback from the decision maker, right? They might also say, what about considering this other possibility? What if we did, could we analyze the possibility of what would happen if we did this? You might add new alternatives, right? So again, the reporting or communication with the decision maker may result in sort of this iterative process of going back to earlier stages. Similarly, right, the last part of step 7, and we'll talk about it, is sensitivity analysis. After you compare the alternative to get your results, right, you want to reevaluate, the assumptions you had, the constraints you had, right, and the set of actions that you analyzed, right. And in doing so, looking at the results before presenting your final report, you may go back and want to run it again with different assumptions or different courses of action and see what you get, right? And so another reason why this would tend to be an iterative process. Okay, so now having gone through introducing the process of cost-benefit analysis, the next step is actually to go through each of those 8 stages in detail. Go through each of the stages and explain exactly what happens at each one of those stages. That is a thorough process, and so we will be saving it for a separate part. So I will be recording a separate presentation detailing each of the 8 steps. And finally, there will be a third part of this introductory lecture, or a video or a PowerPoint show, covering the last 4 bullets that you see there. So with that said, I will sign off from this part of the opening presentation and presumably talk to you or at you soon via part 2 covering cost-benefit analysis step by step.